Welcome to Houston Sports Talk with your host, Robert Land.
Thanks for checking into the best Houston sports podcast, part of the Bleav Network. Joining me for a little Texans conversation is USA Today Texans Wire analyst John Crumpler. Welcome back, John, and happy holidays to you, brother.
Hey, Robert. Thanks for having me on, man. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. How are you doing?
Oh, man. Doing good. Wish the Texans were making me a little bit more excited for these last few games, but the Texans are almost definitely the fourth seed in the AFC, and the likely playoff opponent is the Chargers, Ravens, or Broncos. Can you see a scenario where the Texans put things together, get a couple of wins, and make it to an AFC title game for the first time in their history?
It's honestly really hard to envision that right now. I think they've got all the talent to do it, certainly, but structurally, I think they would need a few things to happen on offense. Even coming away with a win against Jacksonville, I don't think it was exactly a confidence-inspiring performance to play a close game against Mac Jones after the Jaguars lost Trevor Lawrence. And additionally, the defense, I think they're really going to miss Jalen Petrie and Azeez Al-Shaair down the stretch here for these next three games, and we'll see how long Petrie's out. Could they beat the Chargers, the Broncos, whether it's Pittsburgh or Baltimore? Yes, I think so. There's a reason those teams are wild card teams, but winning consecutive playoff points with playoff games, with the current games on the schedule, I would have a hard time seeing it.
CJ Stroud's passer rating's down from 100.3 last year to 87.9 this year. One positive, his completion percentage is nearly identical, even though he's averaging one less yard per pass attempt. What has struck you about CJ's play so far?
It's kind of, what is the anatomy of a sophomore slump? And that looks different for everybody when it does happen. And I know some people have been pretty hesitant to use that term for CJ Stroud, but I'm at the point where I think it's okay. And it's not a knock on the player to say that he's having a difficult second year, but he is having a hard time this year. And I think it's for a lot of reasons outside of his control. It's frankly a lackluster offensive line from a talent perspective and a blocking scheme that I don't think inspires a lot of confidence with the holes defensive coordinators have been able to poke into it. And frankly, for a receiving corps that had a lot of attention nationally coming into the season, Nico Collins has been the only piece they've been able to trust consistently, especially since Stephon Diggs has been out for the year for a couple weeks now, and Tank Dell took a step backwards. To me, right now, when I watch CJ Stroud, it all just looks so hurried. It looks like he's kind of carrying the weight of, hey, Joe Mixon in the run game, they're going to rip some explosives, but they're going to leave me in a lot of 3rd and 10s. And if I don't convert those 3rd and 10s with passes down the field, we're not going to move the chains. And you can see him, it ebbs and flows through the game. You still see those signs of, hey, elite arm talent, elite ball placement, good pocket navigation. But you can also feel the frustration when that protection isn't holding up. And I think you can also feel when he does misfire something that hasn't happened last year. I think it's when all of that just becomes a bit too much and he starts to speed up his process.
His sack percentage last year, 7.08%. It's 9.5% this year. Obviously, that's a big rise. But since Kenyon Green's injury, it's 7.6%. So closer to last year. What I've been frustrated with is not his accuracy, John, but the unnecessary sacks, like when he blew a chance at 3-point Sunday on what should have been a dump off to Dalton Schultz early in the game. He's also moving out of the pocket into sacks, like that 2nd and goal Sunday when he could have just thrown it out of the back of the end zone, John, and maybe had a more realistic chance on 3rd and goal. What do you believe about what he's doing as far as taking maybe some unnecessary stuff?
Yeah, and I think this kind of circles back to that point about playing pressed. I think you watch Stroud he's trying to be a playmaker this year, which is great. I want to see Stroud continue to take steps forward as someone who can extend plays. Some of his best attributes are his vision and his ability to put the ball anywhere on the field. But in looking for those big plays, because he feels like, hey, if I don't produce this, I don't trust the offense to generate it for me via scheme or via the run game. You see, hey, you're going to take some big negatives. If you want to go big game hunting, you open yourselves up to some unnecessary sacks late in the down, to missing some opportunities for easy yardage that this team really relied on the last season. So I think this is part of just his growth as a player and also a real byproduct of an offensive system that isn't necessarily doing Stroud a lot of favors this year.
Yeah, I mean, I remember watching so much of Tom Brady's career, and he just, if he was going to get sacked or get hit, he would just throw it away, and his feeling was, I'll get him the next down." And I need to see that sort of attitude with CJ, because I don't care as much sometimes about the little picture. I care about the big picture, and CJ Stroud's health matters. And the more times you get hit, the more sacks that you take, it just starts to take a toll on your body. It takes a toll on injuries. Tom Brady had the conversation that, with the Aziz hit, a lot of it was discussed about, well, how about the quarterbacks not take as many hits? And I think that was Tom Brady's idea, is like, why are these guys setting themselves up to take as many hits? And Tom just knew, like, the fewer hits that you take, John, the longer your career was going to be. And these guys are just shortening their career. And CJ's got to learn that. It's not just when you're running the football, you're taking hits, but if you're in the pocket and you don't need to, just get rid of the football. And sometimes he looks for the big play, when it's like, he's got to think in terms of big picture sometimes.
Absolutely. And that's something that's going to come with time, though. A young guy in his second year on an offense that can't do anything else. It's a bit of a balancing act. And I have to imagine that's something that, like you're talking about, we're only going to see him start to get a better grip on as he advances into his career.
You mentioned Tank Dell, and that's something that I definitely want to ask you about, because before we get into Bobby Slowik, which I know a lot of people, that's their frustration. But the other surprising part of Stroud's struggles is that lack of chemistry or even confidence. I don't know what it is with Tank Dell, but something has changed this year. And twice in the last 4 weeks, we've seen he threw too late to Dell on sure touchdowns. Tank also dropped the TD in Green Bay. So, John, really, Tank Dell could easily have 5 instead of 2 touchdowns. And I just don't feel like this is a deal where Tank all of a sudden has lost it. I feel like there's some issue with Stroud and Dell getting together on the same page, a lack of confidence or something else. But it doesn't look like Tank Dell is all of a sudden not running as fast or not catching the ball as much, or, he had that drop in the end zone, but I just don't feel like that's the factor here.
A large part of this is that ultimately perception is reality, or optics are reality. And the optics coming away from this year is that they're connecting on big plays less frequently. And that's the truth. But I agree, there's probably a little nuance to why that's happening. Probably a little multifactorial, that we're really watching this offense target Nico Collins, I think, at a higher rate than last year. Like, he's been the unquestioned number one. Dell was really reduced to a gadget, almost like a gadgety player when Stephon Diggs was there. And I think they're having to recreate, refine what his role looks like, what his emphasis looks like, when the offense was built as him as the number 3 option at that wide receiver spot. And then also, like you said, when you miss on some of these moments, if Tank Dell drops a touchdown here and all of a sudden Stroud misses on a throw or two, these connections that were perfect last year, all of a sudden what you walk away feeling about Tank Dell as a player, even if tangibly it might be just a few things here or there when it's on the field beyond whatever's going on schematically, the optics are this big picture and drop off. So I think it's a lot of things. I don't have concerns with Dell. It's not like you're going to walk into the 2025 offseason looking to replace Tank Dell. Like, I think he's your wide receiver moving into next year, but I agree, I've been a bit of a slump for that connection as well. And I think that this all kind of ties back to an offense that doesn't really seem to know what it wants to be.
Before we get to Slowik, just a quick reminder to our listeners and viewers, watch our live Texans post-game shows after every game with Bullpen podcast host Tom Chavaria, who helps me break it all down. Please support our content by giving us a thumbs up, commenting, and subscribing for free on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. All right, John, you felt like Bobby Slowik needed to go a few weeks ago. You wrote about it on your USA Today Texans Wire. Have you seen any significant changes, or is he still a major problem?
Yeah, pulled the trigger pretty early on wanting Slowik out. My editor, Cole Thompson, actually asked me to hold off on that piece for 2 weeks, and I'm glad that he did. But ultimately, by the time I think it was after the Jets game, I ended up writing that piece, and I felt pretty good saying that I think it's time to walk away from Bobby Slowik. And in the weeks since then, I know they've found some more wins. They beat Dallas. Obviously, they beat the Jaguars last week. You have the embarrassing loss of the Titans in there. And I don't necessarily think that Bobby is calling bad games. I think that's fine. But My biggest quarrel with Bobby Slowik, and it kind of ties to this idea of who he is as an offensive coordinator. And I think he very much has this vision. I think he's a good coordinator. I think he's fine at what he does, but he has a way that he wants to run the offense, and it's very in line with the way that he learned football under Kyle Shanahan. They want to be this zone heavy run first team. And that's not where the strength of the Texans lie this year. And I know they're passing plenty. I don't really have complaints about the script, but what it's kind of led to is this drop back passing game with Stroud, and then this zone running game that, and partly due to the offensive line, just is not there to run the ball the way that Bobby wants to. But overall, the offensive product just ends up feeling really disjointed. I don't know what they're trying to do to defenses that ties together, or at least ties together well. And the fact is that they have to pivot off of this identity going into next year, because they don't have the personnel to be who I think Bobby Slowik wants this offense to be. And it's not something you can change in one off season. So my biggest issue is he has not shown an ability to craft a new identity for this team that better fits their personnel. And there's just too much talent here to waste away in hope of a vision that you might not be well suited for.
Did you find it odd that Caserio defended Slowik Monday in a press conference, but in his next breath blamed execution? Isn't execution a huge part of an OC's job?
I mean, yeah, all the coaches, the front office, execution's the word of the year. And they don't think the players are playing well enough. And that's probably because they're not. The offensive line is playing very bad. CJ Stroud has not played up to his standard. I think pretty much everyone on offense, except for Nico Collins and Joe Mixon, has not played up to the standard that you would have subscribed them before the beginning of the season. But at the same time, yes, when you are the offensive coordinator, when you are the boss, it is your responsibility that your unit, your team performs the way that they're expected to, and they just haven't this season. So it kind of goes back to me saying that I don't think Bobby Slowik is necessarily a bad coordinator. I think that the stuff they do schematically in the run game, it's fine. I think there's some wrinkles here and there in the passing game, but none of it really cohesively wraps around the team and this personnel the way that it needs to. And at some point, you can't keep blaming execution when you have a known body of work that says, hey, our players are unable to execute these schemes. At that point, you have to pivot. And I think it's an indictment on this coaching staff that they haven't pivoted. Now, am I surprised Nick Caserio is defending his guy? No. I don't think that's surprising at all. I still think Bobby Slowik's probably still going to get head coaching interviews this season based on what he was able to do last year with CJ Stroud. And if you want to, it's very easy to squint at this and say he didn't have the offensive line that they needed to run the scheme this year. So I think they're going to defend his guy. I do wonder if they run into an awkward situation with the plan, of course, was to elevate Gerard Johnson if Bobby Slowik took a head coaching job this year. And if those opportunities aren't available to Bobby because of how the season has unfolded, what are they going to do with Gerard? I imagine Gerard is going to be ready to take an offensive coordinator job. So Nick Caserio can talk. He loves to talk. He'll talk in circles. But I think we'll see how they really feel about Bobby Slowik in about 2 months here. Yeah,
one of the things that bothers me about Slowik long-term is just his weird and odd calls in big situations. And, it feels like at times he's good early in games, like we've seen he's struggled in first halves, and maybe he has an idea of what he wants to go in and scripted stuff, but it's the stuff more at the back end. They can say, well, nothing changes at halftime, but there are adjustments throughout a game that I just don't feel like he makes, John. Is that fair to say? And then at the end of the game, just some strange calls that, we can go game by game, even going back to last year's Cincinnati Bengals game where Stroud's throwing the pass when they're up 10 and I think there's like 3.5 minutes to go. You're in total control of the game. You just run the ball and you knock 30 seconds off the clock, and the Bengals are in deep trouble there. Instead, Stroud throws the pick six and all of a sudden the Bengals are back in it and they go into overtime.
I'm never going to blame Bobby for putting the ball in CJ Stroud's hands at the end of games, especially last year when he was the offense. I think that's a fine way to play. You live by the sword, you die by the sword, and CJ Stroud is that kind of player. I think that you're willing to take chances with him being the engine of your offense, like in that Cincinnati game last year. But to speak towards this first half idea, I think Nate Tice, he works at Yahoo Sports. He's called Bobby Slowik a opening script merchant. I believe it was Nate Tice. And I kind of buy that for a good bit, that I think the Texans generally have a good idea or a sound plan coming into games that what they want to show teams, how they want to attack them. But as the game pivots, and this almost relates to this arc of the season that we've talked about of, hey, once you're proven that you can't execute certain things, you had to be able to go to the next thing. We know what Bobby Slowik's fastball is, and it's solid. It really is. But when you can hit the fastball, he's not really shown us those off-speed pitches to adjust. And I think that's kind of what's plagued the offense this entire season.
I want to move over to Caserio, and we mentioned the press conference earlier, but just when you look back at his offseason, it was incredible. He hit on Mixon, Aziz, Diggs prior to the injury, of course, Kamari Lassiter, and Kalen Bullock. My one gripe, though, was the safety position. And if you know Petry's going to be more of a slot corner hybrid linebacker going into the season, then why leave the safety spot so thin with injury-prone Jimmy Ward and a rookie next to him and Kalen Bullock? I don't know, John, what am I missing on the value of safety by NFL GMs, especially when nickel coverage is so dominant now and the passing game it feels like it's 70% of what you're going to be defending these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think they just had a lot of faith internally in Jimmy Ward. That's someone who DeMeco Ryans essentially brought with him from San Francisco. And then the vision from day one when they drafted Kalen Bullock, and especially once the game started, has been pretty simple, that they wanted to be able to play some more single high. And this is a team that kind of showed us starting in free agency, they were going to play a lot more man this year with the corners that they signed, and that's manifested. I think Kamari Lassiter's also played very well, but I think the vision for Kalen Bullock was to be able to play single high. And then if you put him with Jimmy Ward, the safeties aren't going to have a lot of responsibilities if it's the two of them. And Eric Murray, for better or for worse, it looks like someone they trust to play limited snaps. And they tried to come down on those early, but I agree. This is a very easily predictable issue that if Jimmy Ward, who had a injury history and was not going to get any younger, missed any time, then, hey, all of a sudden you're not going to be able to limit those Eric Murray snaps. They're going to happen. And now when Petry goes down, yeah, huge hole at the safety position. And I mean, I think I wrote ad nauseum this offseason, I would have liked to have added a safety to that room too, whether that was when Quandre Diggs was still available. Obviously, everybody wanted a part of Justin Simmons, but this is a team that clearly felt comfortable with their own room, in a defense that it doesn't look to value what safety brings individually to the scheme. And they made their bed. We'll see what DeMeco Ryans can ultimately do with it. But it's definitely going to be something to watch as they go into the playoffs, and really even into just this 3-game stretch of defenses that are going to be able to take advantage of that.
Yeah, that's why I don't really understand. Maybe you can explain it to me. MJ Stewart, who they seem to literally have no confidence in him at safety. You know, they don't have the depth. We haven't seen Stewart out there hardly at all. Of course, you know, Stewart, the only thing that he gives you is the special teams. But then we've seen 3 penalties, key penalties from MJ Stewart the last couple of weeks. So, I mean, that's, John, I just like, you got to have guys that can play their position a little bit out on the roster. They just can't be special teams specialists in this day and age.
Yeah, I mean, clearly they were they did not intend to play him there, I don't think. And again, I mean, they probably should, but I really think that a lot of NFL teams kind of look at themselves as, hey, this is the paths to winning a Super Bowl are always pretty narrow. And I'm sure that their thought was, we have 3 safeties who were comfortable playing. And the idea that MJ Stewart was going to be playing major snaps for this team. And also, this is a team that does really value special team contributions, I want to say. So I think that does factor into who makes the roster on this team. That's something they take a lot of pride in. That's something they value, is performing well on special teams. So I'm sure they thought that they were never going to find themselves in this situation. And then if they did, his special team value could ultimately probably justify what they would hope for, at least, is replacement level play. And it just hasn't worked out that way. Just kind of a miscalculation. Again, a position on defense I'm not sure this team valued very much this offseason.
Yeah, to me, Caserio, it's 2 big weaknesses: offensive line, which is obvious, like we've been talking about it all year, but the safety position, really the depth has been the big issue. And I just didn't feel like, you know, I think the fans going into the season, going back to the Justin Simmons chatter and all that sort of stuff, they weren't very confident in it either. But the Texans, let's get to the big picture. Magic number is 2 to get into the playoffs, to win the division. Not sure the Dolphins, is it a must win, but is it, John? Because I'm wondering if there's any hope for this season. If they lose after having 2 weeks to prepare for Miami, it gets ugly because you got the Chiefs and the Ravens on short weeks, and this Dolphins game, it feels in a way like it is a must win if we're going to be serious about the season.
Yeah, I'd probably put it as a must win. It's a game you have at home and a team that, you have a better record at this point in the season. Of course, the Dolphins were without Tua for quite some time, but on paper, you match up with very well. I'm not afraid to call it a must win because right now, if we're being honest, the Texans over the last 2 months have not shown a brand of football where you can beat the Kansas City Chiefs or the Baltimore Ravens. And heck, you just blew your last game to the Tennessee Titans. It's not as if that's a game that you're 100% guaranteed to win, even if right now I would pick them to go into Tennessee and win that game. So I don't think that qualification is unfair at all. And it's going to be a really tough football game. The defense is going to be a little undermanned. And we know Miami, they can put up points, especially when they're not having to go into a cold weather environment. They'll be playing in Houston's dome. So we'll see how that goes. I also think it's a Miami defense that has been steadily improving. But the good news is they've got about 2 weeks here to address some of the protection issues, hopefully kind of reconfigure some of hey, when you have the bye week, you can throw out just, hey, what's working well for us, what's not working well. And your ability just to self-scout, I think that's underrated amongst NFL fans of how important that time is to only have to look at your team. So hopefully they can address some of these issues that have plagued them on the field and deliver a cleaner product and get that win against the Dolphins.
Any last big picture angles that you're looking at? I just kind of curious what else is on your mind. One of the things that, I'll throw out there is Brevin Jordan, the re-signing for him next year was a nice move. And I said it earlier in the season when he went down, I said this is going to be one of the most underrated losses for the Texans this year because he was the only tight end that could legitimately block for you. And you have missed that. We talk about the offensive line all the time, but these tight ends are awful at blocking. And Brevin Jordan was able to do that. And he could give you some other things. It wasn't just that.
On the Brevin Jordan thing, I think it was an easy decision. That's a win-win to bring him back. You go back to the week 1 film and you've got him washing out defensive ends, working to the second level as a blocker. And we all saw what kind of explosive element he can bring to the receiving game in that wild card touchdown against the Cleveland Browns last year. I think it makes a lot of sense. It also kind of puts that position to rest, not something you have to think about too much, especially while Dalton Schultz is still going to be well paid for another season. You want to see what Cade Stover can do in year 2. You've probably allocated enough resources to feel good about tight end for at least for how important it is in your offense right now, moving forward into 2025. I guess my one parting thought that I'll talk about, this is kind of a 5-game audition for Bobby Slowik. Everyone's kind of writing him off in Houston, but if you can make some adjustments at the bye week and you come out, let's say you win 3 of these last 4 and you win a wild card game, I think that's the kind of momentum that there's going to be plenty of head coaching openings. And this is an offense that is coveted by owners. If he can turn this around and the Texans can end the note on a good year offensively, you still might not. It's in the cards. You just don't have the horses to win more than one playoff game. You don't have the personnel on the offensive line. You've got some holes in the defense. At safety, we'll see how the linebacker group ends up playing the year. But if you can win a game and maybe you win 2 games and you turn this around, CJ Stroud starts looking like CJ Stroud again, I think it would be surprising how quickly that narrative can turn back around for Bobby Slowik. So I'm excited to see what kind of offense he puts together and what this reflection period, how they're able to simplify this offense for what's hopefully a cleaner and more efficient product, because right now they're just making life so hard for themselves.
And I will say, John, and I don't know what you think about this, even if Slowik shows you something, you seriously have to evaluate him in the offseason, whether you want to bring him back. But I feel like with Strausser, with the offensive line coach, that's going to be, an issue going forward because I just don't think that he makes I just feel coaching is just such a huge part of the offensive line. And when I look at some other teams and how they look organizationally at the offensive line position, that's a big deal, John. And I remember the difference with some of the different offensive line coaches, and then in the beginning of the Texans franchise, and then bringing in Gibbs and how everything changed. And it didn't seem like it was massive personnel changes. They brought in Myers at center for a 6th-round pick. They had guys that were, they're not journeymen, but they weren't anything extraordinary. I felt like Dwayne Brown, it took him a couple of seconds, but he turned into a really good left tackle. But it was more Gibbs. He just changed the whole, the way the running game worked, the way everything worked. It was just a massive difference. That's how big an offensive line coach, that's how much they can do for you.
Lots of evaluation and self-scouting to do this offseason, I agree, for the Texans. And those seemingly small changes could make a big difference when you already have this much talent in tow.
He's at John H. Crumpler on X. Look for his work on USA Today's Texans Wire. Thanks for giving us a few minutes, John.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. This was fun.
Hey, and just a quick reminder before I let everybody go, if you're new to Houston Sports Talk, it's our 12th year, over 300 guests, 1,500 episodes. Check our Houston Sports History and Memories YouTube playlist, over 200 classic interviews with Houston sports legends. We've talked to H-Town's NFL and NBA Hall of Famers, Olympic legends, ESPN personalities, Houston radio, TV, and newspaper icons, and Team USA World Cup winners. Just a litany of great stuff there. Again, John Crumpler, go check his work out, and we'll talk to you guys again soon.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Hey, don't forget to support us by subscribing and commenting on YouTube. You can always listen to us on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Tell your friends about us and share our show links on social media. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.